Hi everyone. This tutorial is about how to use the various buttons and other inputs on the Vive controller to control things in your virtual production app. It turns out this wasn't really all that difficult to do, so the tutorial is going to be pretty short. The problem was that it was hard to figure out how to do it in the first place because the documentation really wasn't there, and you have to do things in a certain order or they don't work well. To keep things simple, I'm going to demo this with a brand new project. It's just a standard Unreal game project with a blank map. I'd suggest you start by turning on all your Vive stuff. You can see my controllers and trackers are already running. And then you can go into Devices, Controller Settings, Test Controller, and you can make sure that the controller you want to map, this one here, the right one, is actually working. And I'm also going to try and test a tracker that is mounted on keyboard. And that one's working. While you're in here, if you haven't set your Vive tracker roles already, you want to click on the tracker roles button and you want to choose a role for each one of your trackers. In here I've got one assigned to camera, one assigned to keyboard, and one on waist and one on chest. It really doesn't matter what you assign them to, they all just have to be assigned to something different. And now I'll close this up and get the Steam window out of the way and start the process of hooking up some of the controller functions to Unreal functions. The first thing you need to do is to go into Edit, Project Settings, and right here in the main description you want to put something in the project name, and I'm going to put in Input Tutorial. This can be anything, it's just the name that Steam will use to identify the different mappings we're going to make. The next thing we need to do is actually set up the input actions. So we're going to go down here to Engine Input, and you can see there's action mappings and axis mappings. These are both similar, but the action mappings have to do with buttons and the axis mappings generally have to do with analog values. I'm going to stick to just doing action mappings for now to keep it simple. What I'm going to do is set up two action mappings. I'm going to set up one that prints something out when I pull the trigger on the controller, and then I'm also going to set up one that will print something out when I press the power button on one of my Vive trackers. So I'm going to start by creating two action mappings by pressing the plus twice, and I'm going to call the first one trigger, and I'm going to call the second one power button. Now we've got to assign these to something, so we'll click in there and I will click HTC Vive, and this one I want to be on the Vive right trigger. Turns out I don't think it matters what you put in here because the actual mapping happens inside the Steam stuff, but you can't use one of these twice. So for the tracker, I'm gonna call that, say, trackpad, even though it's not going to be a trackpad button. And we can close this up now. And the next thing is we want to go to the SteamVR setup. Now if you don't see this button, what you want to do is you go down to your project settings, scroll all the way down, and you'll see SteamVR, and you want to check this box, and that'll make the SteamVR button appear in your main editor window. So we go up now to SteamVR Input and launch SteamVR Bindings Dashboard, and you should get something that looks a lot like this. It may not have everything on here that's on mine. Once you've started configuring things, some of these things don't go away. If you don't have anything here in current binding, you can create a new binding, but most likely you'll just select Vive Controller with this button and then push the edit button next to the current binding. Now you can see that it says that there are two game actions that have not been bound, trigger and power button. Those are the ones I just made. So we're going to bind the trigger to the right-hand controller trigger. And I'm going to tell it to use the trigger as a button. And then I am going to bind it to the action. You can see now here the button click will is mapped to trigger now. Now I'm going to map the power button on my Vive tracker. You can see this one has no binding, so I'm going to create new binding. And the power button has not yet been bound, so I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say use the power as a button, and I'm going to cause it to trigger the power button input action. The other thing that you have to do in here if you're going to be using this in virtual production is you have to make sure that the action poses are bound to something, and you can see this here is not bound to anything, so I will bound it to special 1. And then we go back into Unreal. Now that we have the input actions in Unreal and they've been bound to actual buttons in Steam, we just have to do something with that. And the way we're going to do that is we go up to a blueprint. I'm going to use the level blueprint. You could use your player controller or anything else. And one of the actions that we made was called trigger. And there it is right there. And the other action was called power button. And there that is right there. And just to keep this simple, all I'm going to do is print out something when one of these buttons is pressed. So I drag this out to print. And then I'll make a duplicate of that and connect it to the power button. And then I'll just have it print trigger and power. Now all we have to do is compile this blueprint, and I can close it and we'll give it a test. And the one thing you should know is that none of the buttons or anything will work unless the player window has focus. So I have to click in the viewport in this case, or if you're using the pie window, you'd click in that. And that gives me mouse control, of course, like this. And now if I go to my Vive controller and I pull the trigger, you can see it prints trigger. And if I go to the tracker and press the power button, it prints power. Now I put my sample functions up here in the level blueprint. Normally you'll want to put these somewhere else. The most obvious place is, at least in my VPStudio project, was the player controller, because that's where all the keyboard and other input gets handled. You can connect these to pretty much any blueprint function that you'd like. In my setup, we have them connected to functions like switching cameras, teleporting the talent around in the level, and taking screenshots. And just because I know someone's going to ask, this is the command you use to take a screenshot. You just do an execute console command and put the command as shot, same as if you were typing it in the console window. And then you would just drag one of your buttons over so that it triggers that command. And there you are. And I'm sure right about now a lot of you are sitting back and saying, wow, that was really simple. And yeah, it is. The only problem is that they don't tell you some things in advance, and the documentation's not real good, so figuring out how to do it the first time isn't simple at all. The most important thing is that you have to do things in the right order. Specifically, you have to create the input actions in Unreal before you try to map them over in Steam. The other thing is, for whatever reason, there aren't any keys in the input actions menus for the trackers, so you have to use some other Steam or Vive related key. You can use pretty much anything. It actually doesn't even care, just as long as you don't use one of those keys twice. You can see the setup here. The key, what I'm talking about, is this one right here, Vive trigger. That could be anything. Steam doesn't really care. And if you want to, you can add another function. You can put multiple things to one input action. So if I wanted to, let's say I could go to the keyboard and say that T will also send a trigger action and trigger those blueprints. So that's about it. I hope this was helpful. See you next time.